Imagine a country so divided that brothers fought brothers, neighbors became enemies, and entire cities were burned by their own people. This war killed more Americans than all other U.S. wars combined, and its scars still shape politics, race, and identity today. This is the story of the American Civil War, America's deadliest war, and the conflict that redefined what it means to be American forever. Long before the first cannon fired and before the first soldier marched onto a battlefield, the United States was already living through a quiet crisis that most people refused to fully confront. On the surface, the nation appeared stable and united under one flag, governed by one constitution and bound by shared revolutionary ideals. Yet beneath that surface were deep fractures that widened with every passing year. These divisions were not sudden, nor were they accidental, but the result of decades of economic, social, and political differences that slowly pushed Americans apart until coexistence became almost impossible. The North and the South were growing into two different worlds, each with its own vision of what America should be, and neither side truly understood the other anymore in the northern states. Industrialization was reshaping daily life at a rapid pace. Factories replaced farms as the center of economic activity, cities expanded, and waves of immigrants arrived seeking opportunity and wages. This region increasingly valued free labor, where individuals could sell their work and move upward through effort and innovation. The idea that a person should own another human being clashed deeply with this economic model, and with the moral arguments gaining strength through religious movements and abolitionist activism. Many Northerners began to see slavery not just as a Southern issue, but as a threat to the nation's moral future and democratic principles. The South followed a very different path. Its economy remained largely agricultural, built around large plantations producing cotton, tobacco, and sugar for global markets. Enslaved labor was not a side element of this system, but its core foundation. Wealth, social status, and political power were all closely tied to slavery, and many Southern leaders believed that any attack on slavery was an attack on their entire way of life. Over generations, slavery became deeply woven into Southern identity, culture, and politics, defended not only as an economic necessity, but also through distorted moral and legal justifications. As these two regions moved further apart, the federal government struggled to keep them together through compromise. Time and again, lawmakers attempted to balance free states and slave states, hoping to preserve peace and unity. Each compromise temporarily calmed tensions, but never resolved the underlying conflict. Instead, every agreement planted the seeds for the next crisis, making future confrontations more intense and more personal. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories became especially dangerous because it directly affected the balance of power in Congress and the future direction of the nation's westward expansion, once a source of national pride, turned into a battlefield of ideology. Every new territory forced Americans to confront the same unresolved question all over again, whether slavery should be allowed to spread or be stopped. This debate was not abstract, as it shaped real lives and real communities, sometimes erupting into violence. In places like Kansas, rival factions fought openly, turning political disagreement into bloodshed and revealing how fragile national unity had become. These conflicts showed that the nation was no longer arguing only with words, but increasingly with fists and guns. Trust between North and South continued to erode as rhetoric grew harsher and fear replaced dialogue. Many Southerners believed they were being economically exploited and politically marginalized by a Northern-dominated government that neither understood nor respected them. At the same time, many Northerners felt the South held the nation hostage, using the threat of disunion to protect an institution they viewed as morally indefensible. Each side believed the other posed an existential threat, and compromise began to look less like cooperation and more like surrender. The role of slavery intensified these fears, because it touched on fundamental questions about freedom, humanity, and the meaning of American ideals. Enslaved people themselves were not passive observers in this growing crisis. Through resistance, escape, and advocacy, they challenged the system that oppressed them and forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. Their actions frightened slaveholders and inspired abolitionists, adding urgency and emotion to an already volatile situation. The moral debate over slavery was no longer confined to political halls, but had entered churches, newspapers, and everyday conversations by the late 1850s. The idea of a shared national future felt increasingly fragile. The election of Abraham Lincoln became a symbol of this breakdown rather than its cause. To many in the South, his victory represented the loss of political power and the beginning of a future where their interests would be overridden. Even though Lincoln initially sought to limit slavery's expansion rather than abolish it outright, fear and mistrust fueled the belief that the Southern way of life was under direct threat. For many Southerners, remaining in the Union seemed more dangerous than leaving it. Secession was therefore not a sudden act of rebellion, but the result of long, simmering anxieties and unresolved disputes. Southern states argued that the Union was a voluntary agreement and that they had the right to withdraw when it no longer served their interests. Northerners, however, saw this as a dangerous precedent that threatened the survival of the nation itself. The Constitution, once seen as a unifying document, became another point of contention, interpreted differently by each side to justify opposing positions. By the time the first shots were fired, the country had already emotionally and ideologically separated. The Civil War did not begin in a moment of madness or confusion, but at the end of a long road paved with fear, misunderstanding, and failed compromise. The nation was divided not only by geography, but by incompatible visions of freedom, power, and identity. This deep division ensured that when war finally came, it would be total, personal, and devastating, because Americans were not just fighting for territory or politics, but for the very meaning of the country they believed they were defending. The long years of tension finally reached a breaking point when political disagreement could no longer be contained within speeches, compromises, and debates. By the time Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the United States was balanced on the edge of collapse. His victory did not come with support from the Southern states, and that fact alone sent a powerful message. Many Southerners felt completely shut out of the political process, convinced that the federal government no longer represented their interests or protected their future. Fear spread quickly, fueled by rumors, speeches, and newspapers that painted the election as the beginning of the end for Southern society almost immediately. Southern leaders began to act on those fears. One by one, states announced their decision to leave the Union, arguing that the Constitution was a compact between states and that they had the right to withdraw if that compact was broken. To them, secession was a legal and peaceful solution to an unbearable problem. They believed they were defending liberty, local control, and their way of life. In their minds, forming a new nation was not an act of aggression, but an act of self-preservation. The North saw these events through a very different lens. For many Northerners, secession was an open rebellion that threatened the survival of the United States itself. If states could simply leave whenever they disagreed with an election result, then democracy had no real meaning. The idea of a permanent union, forged through revolution and sacrifice, was now at risk of dissolving without a fight. This clash of interpretations made compromise almost impossible, because both sides believed they were defending the true spirit of the nation as the Confederate States of America formed, complete with its own government, constitution, and army. The situation grew more dangerous by the day. Federal property in southern states became flashpoints of tension, especially military forts. One such fort, Fort Sumter in South Carolina, became the stage where political conflict finally turned into armed violence. When Confederate forces demanded its surrender and were refused, they opened fire. The cannons that struck Fort Sumter did more than damage a military installation. They shattered any remaining hope that the crisis could be resolved peacefully. The reaction across the country was immediate and emotional. In the North, many who had hoped to avoid war now rallied around the flag, believing the Union must be defended at all costs. In the South, the attack was seen as a bold assertion of independence, and volunteers rushed to enlist, convinced they were fighting for freedom against an oppressive government. On both sides, enthusiasm was high, and the reality of what war truly meant had not yet set in. Many believed the conflict would be short, decisive, and even glorious. These early assumptions were quickly proven wrong. The first major battles exposed the chaos and terror of modern warfare. At places like Bull Run, soldiers discovered that war was not orderly or heroic, but confusing, violent, and deadly. Units became separated, commands were misunderstood, and fear spread faster than discipline. Civilians who had traveled to watch what they thought would be an entertaining spectacle fled in panic as the fighting turned brutal. The illusion of a quick and easy victory vanished almost overnight as the war expanded. Both sides scrambled to organize massive armies from populations that had little experience with large-scale conflict. Training was rushed, equipment was often inadequate, and leadership was inconsistent. The sheer size of the armies involved was unprecedented in American history. Millions of men were pulled from farms, factories, and families, thrust into a world of marching, drilling, and killing. Communities across the country felt the impact almost immediately as young men disappeared from daily life and casualty. Lists began to grow. The Union and the Confederacy each entered the war with different strengths and weaknesses. The North possessed greater industrial capacity, more railroads, and a larger population, giving it long-term advantages in supplies and manpower. The South, however, had experienced military officers and the motivation of fighting on home territory. These differences shaped early strategies and expectations, yet neither side fully understood how long the war would last or how much it would demand from their societies as months turned into years. The conflict escalated beyond traditional battlefield engagements. It became clear that this war would not be decided by a single decisive battle, but by endurance, resources, and the ability to sustain suffering. Families at home felt the pressure as shortages increased, prices rose, and grief became a constant presence. Letters from the front carried stories of hunger, disease, and fear, revealing a reality far removed from early patriotic speeches. Political leadership also faced immense pressure as public opinion shifted with each victory and defeat. Lincoln struggled to maintain support while navigating criticism from all sides. In the Confederacy, leaders faced growing internal divisions and resource shortages that tested their resolve. The war forced governments to expand their power in ways previously unthinkable, including conscription, taxation, and restrictions on civil liberties. The very structure of American governance was being reshaped under the strain of survival. What had begun as a political crisis, rooted in disagreement over power and principles, had now transformed into a full-scale war consuming every aspect of national life. The lines between soldier and civilian blurred as the conflict reached into homes, fields, and cities. The cost of disunion was becoming painfully clear, measured not only in territory gained or lost, but in lives forever changed or ended. By the time Americans fully realized the magnitude of what they had unleashed, turning back was no longer an option, and the nation was locked into a struggle that would demand everything it had to give as the war continued, and the early excitement faded into exhaustion and grief. It became clear that the conflict was evolving into something far larger and more meaningful than either side had originally imagined. What began as a struggle to preserve the Union or defend independence slowly transformed into a moral and social revolution that would redefine the purpose of the war itself. The question of slavery, once carefully avoided or softened in political language, moved to the center of the conflict and forced the nation to confront its deepest contradictions at the start of the war. President Abraham Lincoln was cautious in his approach. His primary goal was to save the Union, and he believed that pushing too hard on the issue of slavery might drive border states into the Confederacy and weaken Northern support. Many Union soldiers initially fought not to free enslaved people, but to restore the nation as it had been. Yet, as the fighting intensified, it became impossible to ignore the role slavery played in sustaining the Confederate war effort. Enslaved labor built fortifications, produced food, and kept Southern society functioning, while white men went to fight. Enslaved people themselves played a crucial role in forcing change. As Union armies moved through Southern territory, thousands of enslaved men, women, and children fled to Union lines, seeking protection and freedom. These individuals, often labeled as contraband of war, challenged existing policies and made it clear that the war could not remain neutral on slavery. Their presence raised urgent questions about justice, humanity, and the future of millions who had been denied freedom for generations. Military necessity and moral pressure eventually pushed Lincoln toward a decisive action. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, fundamentally changed the meaning of the war. While it did not immediately free all enslaved people, it declared that slavery would not survive the conflict. The war was no longer only about preserving a political union, but about redefining the nation's moral foundation. This declaration sent a powerful message to the world and ensured that foreign nations would not support the Confederacy without appearing to defend slavery. The proclamation also transformed the composition of the Union Army. For the first time, African American men were officially allowed to enlist and fight for their freedom. Despite facing discrimination, unequal pay, and brutal treatment if captured, black soldiers joined the fight in large numbers. Their courage and sacrifice challenged racist assumptions and proved that the struggle for freedom was not abstract, but deeply personal. By the end of the war, their service had reshaped public perception and laid the groundwork for future demands for equality. As the war's purpose expanded, so did its scale and intensity. Traditional notions of limited warfare gave way to strategies aimed at destroying the enemy's ability to fight altogether. Union leaders increasingly recognized that victory required more than battlefield success. It demanded the collapse of the Confederate economy and morale. This realization led to a harsher form of warfare that targeted railroads, factories, farms, and supply lines, bringing the reality of war directly into civilian life. Figures like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman embodied this new approach. Grant understood that relentless pressure could exhaust Confederate forces, even at a high cost. Sherman took this strategy further during his march through the South, systematically dismantling infrastructure and resources. While controversial, these tactics demonstrated that the war had entered a new phase, one in which survival required total commitment and total sacrifice. The distinction between front lines and home fronts began to disappear. Technological advancements also contributed to the war's transformation. Rifled muskets increased accuracy and range, making traditional battlefield tactics deadly and outdated. Railroads allowed armies to move and resupply more efficiently, while telegraphs enabled faster communication and coordination. Ironclad ships changed naval warfare, challenging long-held assumptions about dominance at sea. These innovations made the war more destructive and more modern, accelerating the pace at which lives were lost. The psychological impact of this transformation was profound. Soldiers endured relentless stress, witnessing death on a scale few could comprehend. Many struggled with trauma that followed them long after the war ended. Civilians, too, were forced to confront the harsh realities of total war as shortages, displacement, and fear became part of daily life. The romantic vision of war faded completely, replaced by a grim understanding of its true cost. As the conflict grew harsher, it also became more decisive. The moral clarity introduced by emancipation strengthened Northern resolve and gave the war a sense of purpose that extended beyond territorial unity. It reframed the sacrifices being made as necessary steps toward a more just and enduring nation. At the same time, it deepened Southern resistance, as the war now threatened the very foundation of their society by transforming its purpose and methods. The Civil War reshaped not only the outcome of the conflict, but the identity of the United States itself. The nation was no longer fighting to preserve the past, but to define a future built on new principles. The war became a crucible in which old systems were destroyed and new possibilities emerged, ensuring that when the fighting finally ended, America would be forever changed in ways that could never be undone. As the war dragged into its later years, the true cost of the conflict became impossible to ignore. What had once been framed as a necessary struggle for survival or independence now revealed itself as a human catastrophe on a scale the nation had never experienced. Death became a constant presence, not just on the battlefield, but in towns, homes, and hospitals across the country. The number of lives lost surpassed anything Americans could comprehend, and the realization slowly settled in that this war would leave scars that no victory could fully erase. Soldiers faced unimaginable conditions that tested the limits of endurance. Battles were only part of their suffering, as disease claimed far more lives than bullets. Camps were often overcrowded and unsanitary, food was scarce, and medical knowledge was limited. Wounds that might be survivable today frequently resulted in amputation or death. Field hospitals overflowed with injured men, their cries echoing through makeshift tents and buildings. Doctors worked tirelessly, often without adequate supplies, while nurses and volunteers struggled to bring comfort in the midst of overwhelming pain. The emotional toll on soldiers was just as devastating as the physical damage. Many entered the war as teenagers filled with idealism and left it broken by trauma. They witnessed friends die violently, endured constant fear, and lived with the guilt of survival. Though the term did not yet exist, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress followed countless veterans home. Nightmares, anxiety, and isolation became part of their daily lives, silently shaping a generation. Long after the fighting stopped, civilians also paid a heavy price. Entire communities were transformed as men left to fight and never returned. Women took on new roles, managing farms, businesses, and households while facing shortages and uncertainty. Cities and towns near battlefields were destroyed, leaving families homeless and livelihoods ruined. In the South especially, infrastructure lay in ruins, railroads twisted, farms burned, and economies shattered. The physical destruction mirrored the emotional devastation felt by those who had lost everything. Families lived with constant fear, waiting for letters that could bring either relief or heartbreak. Communication was slow and unreliable, making every knock at the door a source of anxiety. Mourning became a shared experience, as nearly every household was touched by loss. Cemeteries expanded rapidly, and mass graves marked landscapes where thousands had fallen. The scale of death forced Americans to confront mortality in ways that reshaped cultural attitudes toward grief, memory, and honor. Enslaved people and newly freed individuals endured unique forms of suffering during this period. While emancipation brought hope, it also brought uncertainty and danger. Many freed families were displaced, lacked resources, and faced violent opposition from those unwilling to accept change. The transition from slavery to freedom was painful and incomplete, marked by struggle and resistance. Despite these challenges, the determination of formerly enslaved people to build new lives became one of the most powerful legacies of the war. The economic cost of the conflict was equally staggering. The federal government accumulated massive debt, industries were strained, and entire regions were left impoverished. The Southern economy, in particular, collapsed under the combined weight of destruction and the loss of enslaved labor. Recovery would take decades, and in some areas, the effects were felt for generations. Poverty and inequality became entrenched, deepening divisions that the war had failed to fully heal politically. The war altered the balance of power within the nation. The federal government emerged stronger, exercising authority in ways that would have been unthinkable before the conflict. At the same time, bitterness and resentment lingered, especially in the defeated South. The end of the war did not bring immediate reconciliation, but opened a new chapter of tension and uncertainty. Reconstruction policies sparked hope for some and anger for others, revealing how fragile peace could be. The sheer scale of sacrifice forced Americans to search for meaning in their suffering. Memorials, ceremonies, and traditions emerged as ways to honor the dead and cope with collective trauma. The idea of the war as a noble sacrifice took hold in different forms, sometimes inspiring unity and sometimes deepening division. Competing memories of the conflict shaped regional identities and political narratives, influencing how future generations would understand what had been lost and why by the time the fighting ended, the United States was a nation forever marked by grief and loss. The war had demanded everything from those who lived through it, leaving behind broken bodies, shattered communities, and unresolved wounds. Victory could not undo the pain or restore what had been taken. The scars of the Civil War became part of the American story, a reminder that the cost of division is measured not only in battles won or lost, but in lives changed forever. The end of the American Civil War did not simply return the United States to the status quo. Instead, it marked the beginning of a profound transformation that would redefine the nation politically, socially, and culturally. The surrender of Confederate forces brought an official end to fighting, but it did not erase the tensions, injustices, and divisions that had caused the war in the first place. The Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, and the federal government had asserted its authority in ways previously unimaginable. But the real work of rebuilding and redefining the country was just beginning, and it would take decades of struggle, legislation, and social change to even begin to realize the vision that the war had fought to achieve. The abolition of slavery, formalized through the 13th Amendment, represented one of the most significant changes in American history. Millions of people who had been denied freedom for generations were now legally free. But freedom alone did not guarantee equality or opportunity. Formerly enslaved individuals faced enormous challenges as they navigated a society that had long been structured around their oppression. They sought land, education, political participation, and economic independence, but often encountered violent resistance, discriminatory laws, and entrenched prejudice. Despite these obstacles, their resilience and determination began to lay the foundation for a new social order, one that would continue to evolve over the next century, and beyond Reconstruction, policies introduced by the federal government aimed to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into political and social life. Amendments to the Constitution granted citizenship and voting rights to Black Americans, theoretically transforming the democratic landscape of the country. In practice, however, implementation was uneven, and backlash from Southern whites was immediate and fierce. Groups such as the Ku Klux Klan emerged, employing intimidation, violence, and terror to suppress political participation and maintain the social hierarchy that had existed before the war. The struggle between progress and resistance defined the post-war South and shaped the contours of American politics for generations. Economically, the war left the nation with both devastation and opportunity. The South had been decimated, its cities, farms, and infrastructure lay in ruins, and the loss of enslaved labor required a complete restructuring of its economy. The North, while less physically damaged, had invested enormous resources into the war effort and faced its own challenges of reintegration and industrial expansion. The war accelerated technological development, encouraged the growth of railroads, and transformed manufacturing processes, creating the conditions for the United States to emerge as a modern industrial power. Yet these changes also highlighted inequalities and fueled tensions between regions, classes, and races that the war had not fully resolved politically. The Civil War and its aftermath strengthened the power of the federal government, confirming that the Union was indivisible and that states could not secede at will. This centralization of authority allowed for national reforms and interventions, including the protection of civil rights, the regulation of commerce, and the management of national finances. At the same time, the war and Reconstruction policies exposed the fragility of democratic institutions when faced with deep social divisions. The ongoing debate over states' rights versus federal authority and the tension between liberty and equality remained central to American political discourse long after the last battles had ended. Culturally, the Civil War left a profound imprint on national identity. Monuments, literature, songs, and memorial ceremonies shaped the collective memory of the war and influenced how Americans understood their history. Regional interpretations often differed sharply, with Southern narratives emphasizing honor, sacrifice, and states' rights, while Northern narratives celebrated preservation of the Union and the triumph of freedom. These competing memories fueled ongoing debates over identity, heritage, and the meaning of citizenship, making reconciliation a slow and often painful process. The human impact of the war continued to resonate for decades. Survivors carried both visible and invisible scars, and communities struggled to recover from the loss of so many men, the destruction of property, and the disruption of social structures. Families were reshaped by absence. Orphaned children grew up in altered households, and returning soldiers faced reintegration into civilian life with lingering trauma. The experience of loss and survival became a shared cultural touchstone that influenced literature, politics, and public life, creating a sense of collective memory that still shapes American identity today, even as the nation emerged from the Civil War with new legal structures and moral imperatives. The promise of full equality remained unrealized. Segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic discrimination persisted, particularly in the South, and the struggle for civil rights would continue for generations. The war had answered some questions about freedom and union, but it left many others unresolved, forcing Americans to confront the ongoing challenge of building a society that truly lived up to the ideals for which so many had fought and died. The legacy of the Civil War also influenced foreign perceptions of the United States. the country's ability to preserve its union and abolish slavery, despite enormous internal conflict, demonstrated both the strength and fragility of democratic governance. Abroad, the war became a symbol of moral struggle, the costs of division, and the potential for renewal. These lessons resonated with other nations facing questions of freedom, authority, and social justice, extending the impact of the American experience beyond its own borders and into the global consciousness. Ultimately, the Civil War redefined what it meant to be American. It established the principle that the Union was permanent, that slavery could not exist under the Constitution, and that the nation could endure profound internal conflict while emerging stronger in some ways, though deeply wounded in others. The war and its aftermath forced the country to confront its contradictions, challenge its assumptions, and attempt to reconcile liberty with justice. The transformation was neither complete nor easy, but it set the stage for the United States to grow into the nation it would become, shaping the political, social, and moral trajectory of the country for generations to come.